This session we'll talk about MVPs and MBIs, both what they are and how they relate to each other. So what we'll learn is first, what are MVPs, what are MBIs, and how they relate to each other. The guiding force of this is that it's not bottom up or top down, but value driven. As we talked about in earlier sessions on the value stream, we want to look at the complete value that's created. And what we're working on must be clear and what it takes to do it. So an MVP, a minimum viable product, originated with Frank Robinson in 2001, and his meaning was the smallest releasable functionality. But it was redefined by Eric Ries to mean the smallest functionality that could be given to select customers to determine if a proposed product is viable. In other words, if you can have a product when you build it. Now, this came out in this lean startup. He followed it up with a book called The Startup Way, which is also just brilliant. And what I really liked about The Startup Way is how he discuss certain case studies of using MVPs to basically look at assumptions and lower risk. And this is really the value of MVPs. It's really about a way of seeing what assumptions have we made about the product that may or may not be true. And we do that to lower the risk. And they're usually built by a small team or maybe a focus group of a few teams. And typically have to use a flow model because you want to be able to get feedback as quickly as possible. And it's not like a part of a system, it's really a full slice, design, usability, reliable, and functional that you're getting. And the idea is you can use it to check the viability of the architecture, the design, but it's typically geared toward the customer. Is this viable? So we don't usually worry so much about architectural issues. In fact, it could even be a prototype, but it could be you're building a full system end to end, but just building it thin slice at a time to get feedback. Now, unfortunately, SAFE has redefined the term, making it so generic as it's almost useless. So I'm not going to be talking about their term, but the MVP as Eric Ries defined it. But the question is this: what do you do when you have an established product? A lot of people talk about MVPs as like, well, this is the next thing we're building. But in an established product, you're not building it to see if you have a product. You already have a product. And the risk signature, in a sense, is a lot less. So you may not be certain of exactly what to build, but you're pretty sure. And multiple teams are often required, especially in a large organization, because your product probably touched a lot of things. And you have to update all those things that are involved. So we came up with the term minimum business increment, or an MBI, and it's the smallest increment of value that we can deliver to the customer that is worth the transaction cost of doing so. This is mostly for established products. It's right size in that, features that can be released, but maybe in and of themselves don't provide value are really too small. Like a fast forward on a DVD, it may not be useful if you don't have a rewind. So you need to look at the whole functionality. Epics, however, are usually too big because very often you could deliver part of the epic. The purpose of an MBI is not doing less. This is very important. It is about delivering value sooner. Now, its predecessor is software by numbers, is minimum marketable feature, or MMF. And again, SAFE's redefined this term. And SAFE and MMF has absolutely nothing to do with the software by numbers use. Both except have this ability, the idea rather, of let's get feedback quickly. But pretty much all of what we're doing is getting feedback quickly. The reason we changed the term at Net Objectives from MMF, minimum marketable feature, to MBI, minimum business increment, was we ran into a lot of clients who were not marketing. They're just internal IT, and they're saying, well, we don't have features, we don't have markets here, we're just doing stuff for our internal people. So MBI was more clear to them, and we didn't run into the issue of, well, we're not a product company, we're just building things internal. And it focuses again on that it's business increments we're looking at. So that's why we changed the name. We also added the content of it's got everything that's needed in a delivery. So we're making that clear. Okay. Also, MBIs must be what's called fully kitted. And by fully kitted, we mean that it's got a checklist that contains all the elements that are necessary to complete a task or a project. This comes from Goldratt's Rules of Flow. The idea is like if you're going to paint a house, before you started, you'd make sure you have the paint, the ladders, the brushes, whatever it was you needed, the rollers. You don't start if you're going to get stopped. This could be considered like a definition of ready for a minimum business increment. But fully kitting comes from theory of constraints, and it's a good term, so we use that. And it's not enough to build the functionality to deliver. In other words, if you build functionality, but you don't have a way to release it and support it, it really doesn't do any good. So this full kitting is basically included in the MBI. Here's the minimum functionality we can deliver, and here's all the things it takes to deliver, deploy it, and have the customer get value. This is very, very important when you're in larger companies, because a lot of times the functionality is going to be accounted for with CapEx, but the support is going to be funded by OpEx, and MBI should have funding for both of these, and we'll take advantage of that at large when we get into mid-scale with Amplio, because then you're saying, well, I fund the MBI. By funding the MBI, then I'm making sure I have all the things I need to get it out the door, and that's very important. MBIs enable a focus across teams, because if multiple teams are working on the MBI, they actually know that they should be working with the other teams at about the same time. So you don't have like a long delay between a part of the MBI being built that's worked with another part of the MBI by another team. You want to do them in as close proximity time-wise as you can, because you're removing the delay and less waste is created, and that's important. Okay. Now, where do MBIs come from? How do you look at the whole thing? Well, creating strategies and overall initiatives operate at a slower pace. Could be done quarterly. Could actually be done with beyond budgeting and maybe faster, but both companies it's a big improvement if they just go to quarterly. So the idea is you can look at the business, the vision of the business, create strategies, use OKRs or some other measure on how you're going to measure success, have initiatives, and maybe what we call business initiatives. The initiatives might be really big, but now we're saying, well, we're going to break these down into things we're funding, and these could be MBIs or MVPs. In other words, we're taking these initiatives, breaking them down as a sequence of smaller items, building them, and we can decompose these or find the first part of an MVP perhaps, and build these in segments. So what's nice about this is the MBIs go directly back to the vision of the business and this initiatives. And this is what we call line of sight. So an MBI gives us this chunk of what we should be looking at. And then of course we have to decompose these further into features and stories. But there's something nice about this decomposition in features and stories. We only need to do those implementations of the features and the stories that relate to the MBI. Sometimes features can cut across several MBIs. And what we want to look at is how MVPs and MBIs create a bridge basically between the business side and the development side. This is very nice, because now you can talk about it from both perspectives using the same concept. So MBIs to the business look like, oh, this is the thing I'm going to get next. And to the development, this is what we have to build next and what we're going to focus on. So this is really good, because now both sides, even though they're working on different parts, and even though they have different ways of working, they have this common language. So you can talk about what are we getting, what MBIs are we focusing on, what value do we expect to get next, and track these on a board that way. The scope of an MBI is created by looking at market segments and functionalities. We'll get into the specifics of this in another session. Again, MBIs are also containers for who is needed to get value deployed, the full kitting, and this helps create alignment across the value stream. The scope of MVPs is created as one builds them. It's a thin slice at a time that informs the next slice. So they typically need to be built by a single team, or maybe a small group of focused teams. MBIs help avoid a lot of problems, taking too long to get things done because it's smaller, people working on too many items at the same time because you work on the most important MBI. When people can't see the top line of value being worked on, that causes a variety of problems. So an MBI enables visibility of the focus of work. And if you don't have MBIs, you end up needing extra alignment, or actually more like coordination, because you don't have fully cross-functional team. And that's an important thing to look at. Okay, they aid visibility because you basically track them. If you know where all your MBIs are, you at least know where people are working and what they're working on. Ops can see what's coming. Different teams know to work on related pieces at about the same time might make integration easier. This is especially true if you're working on sprints. Then if you're working on related features, do them at the same time. So at the end of the sprint, you can integrate. That'll speed things up. Getting people in different roles and problems are discovered sooner because you're coordinated around the MBI. And nothing required for marketing or selling is left out. So when it's ready, it's ready to be sold and supported. Makes a lot of things better. Helps the budgeting process, as I mentioned, with CapEx and OpEx. Helps people work on smaller chunks of work as they're focusing on getting the MBI done, then go to the next MBI. Helps refine an intake process because you basically put an MBI into the intake of the development because that's what needs to get built. And they're easier to prioritize because they're not too big or too small. Kind of makes sense doing it. So here's how they create alignment. They represent the value to be delivered to the stakeholders. So people across different teams know this. It's not a team thing, it's an across team thing. It's an organization thing. And MBIs are bridges between, again, the business and development. So MBIs can see what's going on. It aligns the two sides there. It's very useful. It's an aligning concept. And everyone needs to be in agreement about this. This is what we're building. Everybody agrees that. It's like a laser pointer for cats. This is what you focus on. This is what you look at. It's very important. Okay. Now, MBIs and MVPs, I want to do a little bit of comparison on these. And there are several different things to look at in the minimum viable product and in minimum business increments. Now, it's not one or the other, actually. That's why I put that grid in the middle there to demonstrate that in fact, it could be a combination of the two. I mean, maybe you're getting a return on investment, you know that, but maybe I'm trying to test out if this particular feature or something is useful. You always have to validate both of these, but in one, you're trying to see, do I have a product? And the other, you're trying to get a return of money on it. Where's my focus? On an MVP, it's learning. Focuses on building on the MBI. Again, you do a bit of both, so it's not one or the other. Creating a new product for the early adopter in the customer market, typically extending to an existing base, maybe going out to a new market segment. You have focused interaction with prospective clients on the MVP. You've got to be interacting with them on as quickly as you can get new functionality for them to verify. Whereas in an MBI, you got an existing organization through existing channels. You might have a new market segment that makes a difference. Yes, that is possible. You typically start with a dedicated team or a small group of teams. Likely in an MBI in a larger organization, it's going to be several teams because the product exists and it's being spread out across several teams. With MVPs, you start with small features and expand. With MBIs, there are actually two ways to go. You could decompose it into features that implement only the scope of the MBI. Sometimes the analysis, you do come from the stories and the features, you build it up and say, oh, this is what I can deliver sooner. And then you just defer anything that's not needed for it. That's two different ways of building them or defining them rather. There's little impact on existing products as this is new, but it might because it could be something that's added to a pool of products. That's again why it's not one or the other, but it's almost certain to interact with multiple systems on an MBI. Now, again, it's not an MVP or an MBI, but degrees of each. And finally, the MVP is we may not have a viable market. We're trying to discover this early. Whereas enhancements may not be as valuable as anticipated. We do have to validate it. It may affect other offerings, but we're kind of confident we've got something going on that we'll be adding value to. So I want to compare a little bit the focus on MBIs to a focus on sprint goals because they're different. So MBIs don't exactly end up with a sprint goal. You don't release at the end of a sprint all the time. In Scrum, you can release anytime, and that's a good thing. But there isn't this exact alignment because MBIs are as big as they are. I mean, they're the minimum. So if it's going to take you a week and a half to do it, you don't want to take 2 weeks to do it. You don't want Parkinson's law driving you. So they're often a better guide. Even if you're doing Scrum, then focus on the MBIs and do the releases. So like when an MBI is completed, it should be shown to the customer immediately if you can, and possibly released if you're set up to do more continuous releasing. MBIs that take more than one sprint. Now this is kind of interesting. When you've got an MBI that might take 6 weeks to do, then the MBI itself kind of gives you a bigger picture guidance of, well, we're doing this the first week, first sprint, we're doing this next part, the second sprint, but we got this overall view of the MBI across multiple sprints. Now, this is, of course, would be in a product backlog as well, but the MBI again adds a little focus, and focus is good. MBI short of the sprint, keep a focus on quick completion and release, again, avoiding Parkinson's law, that the work will fill the time allotted. Okay, so in review, MVPs are used for exploring if a new product is viable. MBIs are useful to tie business and delivery together. They speak to both business and development. They're used to enhance existing products. MBIs are focused on value consumed, and they create alignment. And they are more effective for prioritization because they're the proper size to prioritize.